The coffee was still warm in my hands when I heard the familiar sound of my husband's car pulling into our driveway. December the 15th, 3:47 p.m. In my previous life, I had been excited by that sound. Today, I simply took another sip and watched the first snowflakes begin to fall through our kitchen window. Amelia, we need to talk. David's voice carried that particular tone I had once mistaken for concern. Now I recognized it for what it truly was. Calculated manipulation wrapped in false gentleness. I turned slowly, letting my face show the same trusting smile I had worn before. Of course, darling. What's on your mind? He stood in the doorway, still in his expensive winter coat, his dark hair slightly mussed from the wind. Even now, I could admit he was handsome. It was one of the reasons I had fallen so completely into his trap the first time around. Beauty, I had learned too late, could be the most dangerous weapon of all. It's about the cabin, he said, stepping closer. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of his sister, Victoria's car pulling up. Right, on schedule. The weather service is predicting a massive storm tonight. I think we should head up there and secure everything before it hits. In my first life, I had eagerly agreed. The mountain cabin had been my sanctuary, inherited from my grandmother along with the rest of her considerable estate. I had trusted David completely when he suggested we marry quickly after my grandmother's death, believing his concern for my grief was genuine love. I had even been grateful when Victoria offered to help manage the legal paperwork, never questioning why a woman who barely spoke to me suddenly wanted to be so involved in my affairs. A storm? I asked, injecting just the right amount of worry into my voice. How severe? Severe enough that we could be snowed in for days if we don't leave soon. His hand found my shoulder, the same gentle touch that had once made me feel protected. Victoria thinks we should drive up together, make sure everything is properly winterized. Victoria, my devoted sister-in-law, who had cried such pretty tears at my funeral. The same woman who had somehow managed to produce a will, supposedly written by my own hand, leaving everything to my beloved husband and his grieving family. The same woman who now stood on my porch, stamping snow from her designer boots, preparing to help murder me for the second time. I glanced at the calendar hanging beside our refrigerator. December 15th was circled in red ink with cabin trip written in my own handwriting. I had made that mark in my previous life, so excited about a romantic winter getaway with my husband. How naive I had been. I suppose we should be responsible, I said softly, setting down my coffee cup. Let me pack a bag. David's smile was warm and loving, the same expression that had graced our wedding photos just 18 months ago. That's my girl. Victoria's already loaded the car with supplies. We should leave within the hour. Through the window, I watched Victoria approach the house. She moved with the same confident stride I remembered, her auburn hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, her coat worth more than most people's monthly salary. In my previous life, I had admired her sophistication, had even felt grateful that David's family had welcomed me so warmly after my grandmother's death left me alone in the world. The doorbell chimed, and Victoria swept in with a flurry of cold air and expensive perfume. Amelia, darling, she said, pulling me into an embrace that felt genuine enough to fool anyone watching. I hope you don't mind me suggesting this little expedition, but with the storm coming, I couldn't bear the thought of your grandmother's beautiful cabin being damaged. Of course not, I replied, returning her hug with the same warmth I had shown before. I appreciate you thinking of it. What I didn't say was that I knew exactly how much she had thought about it. In my first life, I had died believing it was an accident. I had thought the locked doors were stuck from the cold, that the missing keys were simply misplaced in the chaos of the storm. I had died thinking my husband and his sister were desperately searching for me in the blizzard, not knowing they were actually 3 states away, establishing their alibi while I froze to death in the wilderness. But death had not been the end for me. I had awakened in our bed on the morning of December 14th, my heart racing with the vivid memory of ice crystals forming on my eyelashes as my body slowly shut down. At first, I had convinced myself it was just a nightmare, a manifestation of some deep anxiety about the approaching anniversary of my grandmother's death. Then, I had noticed the calendar. December the 14th, exactly 24 hours before the accident that had claimed my life. David was already gone for the day, attending to what he called urgent business that I now knew involved finalising the forged will that would transfer my inheritance to him upon my death. The realisation had hit me like a physical blow. I was alive, I was back, and I had exactly 1 day to decide what to do with this impossible second chance. "Are you feeling all right, dear?" Victoria's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "You look a bit pale." "Just tired," I said, forcing a smile. "I didn't sleep well last night." "Well, the mountain air will do you good," David said, checking his expensive watch. "Why don't you go pack? We really should leave soon if we want to beat the worst of the weather." I nodded obediently and headed toward our bedroom. As I climbed the stairs, I heard them speaking in low voices in the kitchen. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I knew they were discussing the final details of their plan, making sure everything was in place for my second murder. In my room, I packed slowly and deliberately. I included the same items I had brought the first time. Warm clothes, toiletries, the book I had never finished reading because I had died before reaching the final chapter. But this time, I also added some items they wouldn't expect. The spare key to the cabin that I had hidden in my jewellery box. My grandmother's satellite phone that David didn't know existed. And most importantly, the small digital recorder I had purchased that morning while he was out. 24 hours wasn't much time to prepare, but it was more than they had given me in my first life. Then I had walked blindly into their trap, trusting and helpless. This time I would walk into it with full knowledge of what was coming, armed with the one weapon they couldn't anticipate, the truth about their own plan. As I zipped my bag closed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. I looked exactly as I had before, 26 years old, with long dark hair and the kind of delicate features that made people want to protect me. It was ironic that those same features had made me such an appealing victim. But appearances could be deceiving. They had killed a trusting, naive young woman who believed in the goodness of people. They would not be killing that person again. The woman they faced now had been forged in ice and betrayal, tempered by the ultimate lesson in human nature. I returned downstairs to find them waiting by the door, David holding my coat like the devoted husband he pretended to be. "Ready?" he asked, helping me into the heavy wool coat that would, in a few hours, be all that stood between me and the killing cold. "Ready?" I confirmed, accepting a kiss on my cheek from the man who had murdered me. As we walked to the car, Victoria chattering about the beauty of fresh snow, and David carrying my bag like a gentleman, I allowed myself one moment of grim satisfaction. They thought they were taking me to my death for the second time. What they didn't realise was that I was taking them to theirs. The drive to the cabin would take 2 hours through increasingly treacherous mountain roads. In my previous life, I had spent those 2 hours laughing at Victoria's stories and holding David's hand whenever he wasn't shifting gears. I had been so happy, so grateful to have found love after the devastating loss of my grandmother. This time I would spend the drive watching the snowfall and remembering exactly how it felt to die alone in the darkness, calling their names until my voice gave out and the cold claimed me. The difference was that this time I wouldn't be alone when the darkness came. This time they would be right there with me, finally experiencing the fate they had planned for someone who had loved them with her whole heart. I settled into the passenger seat and buckled my seatbelt, smiling peacefully as David started the engine. Behind us, Victoria was arranging blankets and supplies, playing her role as the concerned sister-in-law perfectly. This is going to be a wonderful trip, she said brightly, as we pulled out of the driveway. Yes, I agreed, watching our house disappear in the rearview mirror. I think it's going to be exactly what we all deserve. The snow was falling more heavily now, coating the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. In the distance, I could see the dark clouds that would soon unleash the storm that had killed me once before. But storms, I had learned, could be survived if you knew they were coming. And this time, I was the one who knew everything that was coming. Every lie they would tell, every excuse they would make, every moment when they would reveal their true faces. I had lived through this day once as a victim. Today, I would live through it as something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The mountain road wound upward through increasingly dense forest, each turn bringing us deeper into the wilderness that would soon become our prison. I kept my breathing steady, my hands folded calmly in my lap while David navigated the worsening conditions with the same confident ease he had shown the first time. The GPS is getting spotty, Victoria observed from the back seat, though I knew she was lying. She had memorised this route weeks ago, just as she had memorised every detail of their plan. Good thing you know these roads so well, David. I could drive to Amelia's grandmother's cabin blindfolded, he replied, reaching over to squeeze my hand. His palm was slightly damp with perspiration despite the cold. Nerves, perhaps. Or excitement. We've made this trip so many times. 7 times, actually. I had counted during my first life, back when I thought these visits were romantic getaways instead of scouting missions for my murder. Each trip had been meticulously planned by David to study the cabin's isolation, the unreliable cell service, the single winding road that could be easily blocked by weather. I'm so glad we're doing this together, I said softly, letting my voice carry the same trust and affection it had held before. It means so much to have family who cares. Victoria's laugh was musical and warm. Of course, darling, family looks out for each other. The word family tasted bitter in my mouth, but I swallowed it down. In my first life, I had craved belonging so desperately after losing my grandmother that I had mistaken their calculated kindness for genuine love. Now I understood that the only family I had was myself. The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes now, accumulating on the road surface faster than the occasional snowplow could clear it. Perfect conditions for what they had planned. In my previous life, I would have suggested turning back by now, worried about our safety. This time, I remained silent, watching the storm build with the calm acceptance of someone who had already seen how this movie ended. There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you, Victoria said suddenly, her tone carefully casual, about your grandmother's legal affairs. Here it comes, I thought, the first phase of their psychological manipulation. Oh. I turned in my seat to face her, arranging my features into an expression of mild interest. I've been reviewing the estate documents with my attorney, just to make sure everything is properly structured for tax purposes, you understand. And there are some irregularities. David's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. What kind of irregularities? Nothing serious, Victoria assured us quickly. Just some paperwork that might need to be updated. Amelia, dear, I'm not sure your grandmother's lawyer filed everything correctly after her death. There might be some documents missing. In my first life, this conversation had filled me with anxiety. I had trusted Victoria's legal expertise completely, grateful that someone was looking out for my financial interests. I had even signed new papers that night at the cabin, papers I thought were minor corrections to my grandmother's will. Now I knew those papers had been my actual death warrant, documents transferring my inheritance to David in the event of my death, backdated to appear as if they had been signed months earlier. That's concerning, I said, allowing worry to creep into my voice. What kind of documents? Primarily your will, actually. Victoria leaned forward conspiratorially. I don't think you have a proper one on file. If something were to happen to you, David might have legal difficulties claiming his rightful inheritance as your husband." The audacity was breathtaking. They were discussing my murder while sitting 3 feet away from me, framing it as concern for my husband's financial security. I hadn't really thought about it, I admitted, which was true. At 26 and in perfect health, mortality had seemed like a distant concern. "I suppose I should have something official drawn up." "Actually," Victoria said, reaching for her briefcase, "I took the liberty of having my attorney draft something basic. Nothing complicated. Just a simple document ensuring David would inherit your grandmother's estate if anything happened to you. We could execute it tonight, get it notarized when we return to town." She produced a manila folder with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment. The papers inside were formatted to look official, complete with legal language and signature lines. To an untrained eye, they would appear perfectly legitimate. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said, accepting the folder. "I'll review it tonight." What I didn't say was that I had already seen these exact documents. In my first life, I had signed them eagerly, touched by Victoria's foresight and grateful for her help. I had even thanked her for thinking of details I had overlooked in my grief. This time, I would sign them again. But first, I would make some modifications they wouldn't discover until it was far too late. "We're almost there," David announced as we passed the familiar marker, indicating 5 miles to the cabin. "Just in time, too. This snow is really picking up." Through the windshield, I could see the storm intensifying exactly as it had before. The weather service had predicted a historic blizzard, the kind that happened once every few decades. By midnight, we would be completely cut off from the outside world, trapped by snowdrifts that could reach 15 feet in some areas. In my previous life, that isolation had terrified me when I realized what was happening. Tonight, it would terrify them. The cabin appeared through the trees like a scene from a postcard. Rustic logs and stone, warm yellow light glowing from the windows, smoke curling from the chimney. David had driven up earlier that week to prepare it, or so he had told me. In reality, he had been setting the stage for my death, ensuring the doors could be locked from the outside, and hiding the spare keys where I would never find them. "Home sweet home," Victoria said cheerfully as we pulled into the circular driveway. We unloaded our bags and supplies quickly, the wind already picking up enough to sting our faces with snow. David insisted on carrying everything, playing the devoted husband right until the end. I let him, knowing that his gallantry was just another part of their performance. Inside, the cabin was exactly as I remembered. My grandmother's furniture arranged around a massive stone fireplace, family photos lining the mantelpiece, the scent of cedar and old memories lingering in the air. It had once been my sanctuary. Tonight, it would be their tomb. "I'll get a fire going," David said, already moving toward the hearth with practiced efficiency. "And I'll start dinner," Victoria added. "I brought everything we need for a proper feast." A last meal, I thought grimly. How appropriate. While they busied themselves with domestic tasks, I walked to the large windows overlooking the valley below. The snow was falling so thickly now that I could barely make out the lights of the distant town. Soon even those would disappear, leaving us alone in our snow globe of carefully orchestrated death. My reflection in the dark glass showed a woman who looked peaceful and content, grateful to be spending time with her beloved family. But beneath that serene surface, I was counting hours until they would reveal themselves, counting the steps to the basement where my grandmother's emergency supplies waited, counting the ways I would watch them experience the terror I had felt as I died alone in the cold. "Amelia?" David called from the fireplace. "Could you help me with this kindling?" "Of course," I replied, turning away from the window with a smile. The performance was about to begin in earnest. In a few hours, they would suggest a romantic walk in the snow. They would lead me away from the cabin, then claim they needed to return for something they had forgotten. They would lock me out and drive away, leaving me to freeze to death while they established their alibi in another state. At least, that was their plan. My plan was considerably different. Tonight, for the first time in my life, or lives, I would be the one doing the leaving. Dinner was a masterpiece of false intimacy. Victoria had prepared all my favourite dishes: herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables, the chocolate mousse cake that had been my weakness since childhood. She served it on my grandmother's finest china, the same plates that would be found shattered on the kitchen floor after my tragic accident, evidence of the struggle that supposedly occurred when I tried to break back into the cabin. "This is absolutely delicious," I said, savouring each bite with genuine appreciation. It would be my last meal, after all, though not in the way they intended. "Your grandmother's recipes," Victoria replied, beaming with pride. "I found her old cookbook in the kitchen last time we visited. I thought it would be meaningful to honour her memory." The irony was exquisite. They were honouring my grandmother by murdering her granddaughter in the home she had built with her own hands. But then again, they had never possessed what could be called shame. David poured wine with ceremonial flourish, filling our glasses with an expensive Bordeaux. "To family," he said, raising his glass, "and to the memories we make together." "To family," Victoria echoed. "To getting what we deserve," I added quietly, clinking my glass against theirs. They exchanged a brief look, satisfaction masked as affection. They thought I was toasting their success. In a way, I suppose I was. As we ate, I listened to them weave their careful conversation around the trap they were constructing. Victoria mentioned again how isolated the cabin was, how the storm would make travel impossible until morning. David spoke of his early meeting in the city tomorrow, establishing his reason for wanting to leave tonight despite the weather. They were building their alibi one casual comment at a time. "I should probably look over those legal documents after dinner," I said during a lull in conversation. "I want to understand exactly what I'm signing." "Of course," Victoria said smoothly. "Though I should mention, my attorney stressed the importance of getting them notarized quickly. There are some time-sensitive tax implications." Another lie, but delivered with such practiced sincerity. Victoria had missed her calling as an actress. After dinner, I excused myself to the bathroom, while they began clearing dishes. This was my opportunity to retrieve the items I had hidden during our previous visits. Items David didn't know existed because he had never bothered to truly explore the place he planned to steal. In the bathroom linen closet, behind stacks of towels, I found my grandmother's old jewellery box. Inside, nestled beneath costume pearls and vintage brooches, was the satellite phone she had kept for emergencies. Unlike cell phones, it would work regardless of the storm. I slipped it into my sweater pocket, then retrieved the spare cabin keys I had hidden there months ago. When I returned to the living room, David was feeding logs to the fire, while Victoria arranged the legal documents on the coffee table with theatrical precision. She had even brought her own notary stamp, fraud tools disguised as professional preparation. "These look very official," I said, settling into the armchair across from them. I picked up the first page and began reading, letting my eyes move slowly across the text as if I was genuinely absorbing the content. The documents were masterfully crafted forgeries. Every detail had been considered, from the watermarked paper to the precise legal language. If I hadn't known they were fake, I might have been impressed by the quality of their deception. "Is there anything you'd like me to explain?" Victoria asked, pen poised to make notes. "Just one thing," I said, looking up from the papers. "This clause here about David inheriting everything in the event of my death. It seems rather comprehensive." David leaned forward with an expression of loving concern. "We just want to make sure you're protected, sweetheart. If something happened to you, I'd want to preserve your grandmother's legacy exactly as she intended." "By giving it to someone who isn't her blood relative?" The question hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and I could see them recalibrating their approach. "Well," Victoria said carefully, "you and David are married. In the eyes of the law, he is family now." "Of course," I agreed, smiling warmly. How silly of me to question it. I signed the documents with steady hands, my signature identical to the one I had given in my first life. Victoria notarized each page with professional efficiency, stamping and dating them as if they were legitimate legal instruments, rather than elaborate murder props. "There," she said, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "All finished. These will go straight to my attorney's office when we return to town." If we return to town, I thought, but only one of us would be making that journey. "I think I'll step outside for some fresh air," I announced, rising from my chair. "The storm is so beautiful from the porch." This was it, the moment they had been waiting for all evening. In my first life, they had suggested the walk themselves, framing it as a romantic gesture. This time, I was giving them the opening they needed while maintaining the illusion of innocence. "In this weather?" David asked, though I could see the excitement building behind his eyes. "It's really coming down out there." "Just for a moment," I said, moving toward the coat closet. "I love watching snow fall at night. It's so peaceful." "We should all go," Victoria suggested, already reaching for her jacket. "Strength in numbers and all that." Of course they would want to come. They needed to be present for the crucial moment when they would lock me out and drive away. What they didn't know was that I had no intention of being locked anywhere. We bundled into our winter gear with the same care I had shown in my first life. Heavy coats, thick gloves, sturdy boots designed for mountain weather. David held the door for me like a gentleman, and Victoria linked her arm through mine like a devoted sister. The cold hit us immediately, sharp and clean and absolutely merciless. Snow was falling so heavily that visibility was reduced to perhaps 10 feet. The wind had picked up significantly, creating drifts against the cabin walls that were already knee-deep. "Beautiful," I breathed, and meant it. There was something magnificent about nature's raw power, the way it could transform a landscape into something alien and dangerous. In my first life, this storm had been my executioner. Tonight, it would be my weapon. "Should we walk down to the lake?" David suggested, pointing toward the path that led away from the cabin. "The view is spectacular in weather like this." The lake where they planned to abandon me, far enough from the cabin that I would freeze to death before I could find my way back in the storm. In my first life, I had agreed eagerly, enchanted by the idea of sharing a winter wonderland with my beloved husband. "That sounds wonderful," I said, taking David's offered arm. We began walking into the storm, our footsteps already being erased by the falling snow behind us. With each step away from the cabin, I felt them growing more confident, more excited about the culmination of their months of planning. What they didn't realize was that I had spent those same months learning every inch of these woods, memorizing every path and landmark. While they had been plotting my death, I had been unconsciously preparing for my survival. "How much farther?" Victoria called over the wind after we had walked for several minutes. "Almost there," David replied, though I knew we were barely halfway to the lake. It was time. In my first life, this was the moment when he had claimed to have forgotten something important back at the cabin. When they had both insisted I wait by the frozen lake while they retrieved it. When they had locked me out and driven away, leaving me to die alone in the wilderness. But tonight, I was the one who would be doing the leaving. "Oh," I said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the path. "I think I left the stove on in the kitchen." It was a small lie, but it would serve its purpose. David and Victoria exchanged glances, clearly debating whether to adjust their plan or stick to the script. "Are you sure?" David asked. "I thought we checked everything before we left." "I'm probably being paranoid," I said, "but I can't shake the feeling. Would you mind if we went back to double-check? I'd feel terrible if something happened to Grandmother's cabin because of my carelessness." Of course, Victoria said quickly. Better safe than sorry. We turned back toward the cabin, walking against the wind now. The snow was falling so heavily that even the warm lights of the windows were barely visible through the storm. Perfect conditions for what was about to happen. As we approached the porch, I made my move. While they were focused on shaking snow from their coats, I quietly slipped the spare keys from my pocket and palmed them in my gloved hand. I'll check the kitchen, I said, reaching for the door handle. But instead of going inside, I would be stepping out of their reach forever. Because this time, I knew exactly what they were planning. And I had a much better plan of my own. I turned the door handle and stepped inside, but instead of heading to the kitchen, I moved swiftly to the window overlooking the driveway. Through the heavy curtains, I watched David and Victoria position themselves by their car, thinking I couldn't see them through the storm. "The stove is fine," I called out loudly enough for them to hear. "Just my imagination." But I didn't move toward the door. Instead, I activated my grandmother's satellite phone and pressed record on the small device I had hidden in my coat pocket hours earlier. David's voice carried clearly through the wind as he spoke to Victoria near the car. "Now? We do it now, while she's distracted." I opened the front door just wide enough to hear Victoria's response. "The keys? Already have them. She'll never get back inside." "And the car?" 20 minutes to reach the main road, then straight to the hotel. Perfect alibi. They thought I was still checking the kitchen. They thought they had more time to finalize their plan. What they didn't realize was that I was recording every word of their conspiracy to murder me. I stepped back outside, closing the door behind me with deliberate force. "All clear," I announced cheerfully. "Sorry for the false alarm." "Actually, Amelia," David said, his voice taking on that familiar tone of false concern, "Victoria and I were just discussing the weather conditions. This storm is getting dangerous. We think we should head back to town tonight." "Tonight?" I let my voice rise with appropriate worry. "But the roads must be terrible by now." "That's exactly why we need to leave immediately," Victoria added, "before we get completely snowed in." In my first life, this was when panic had set in. When I realized they intended to abandon me here alone. When I had begged them not to leave me, promising I would sign anything, do anything, if they would just take me with them. This time, I smiled serenely. "Of course, that makes perfect sense." David blinked, clearly thrown by my calm acceptance. You understand?" "Completely. The safety of the family comes first." I pulled out the cabin keys, not the hidden spares, but the main set they expected me to have. "I'll just lock up quickly." I turned toward the door, listening to their confused whispers behind me. They had expected resistance, tears, desperation. My compliance was disrupting their carefully rehearsed script. But as I reached for the lock, David's hand closed over mine. "Actually, sweetheart, why don't you let me handle that? You go get in the car where it's warm." This was it, the moment when they would take my keys and lock me out forever. In my first life, I had handed them over trustingly. This time, I let him take them, while secretly gripping the spare set in my other hand. "Such a gentleman," I murmured, walking toward their car. I heard the solid click of the deadbolt engaging, followed by David testing the handle to ensure it was secure. Victoria was already starting the engine, exhaust visible in the frigid air. They thought they had won. They thought I was trapped outside while they escaped to safety. But instead of getting in the car, I stepped behind the large pine tree that dominated the front yard. From there, I had a perfect view as David jogged toward the vehicle, his face bright with satisfaction. "Done," he said, climbing into the passenger seat. "She'll never get back inside. And in this storm, she'll be dead within 2 hours, Victoria replied matter-of-factly. "Hypothermia sets in fast at these temperatures." By morning, we'll be back in the city with a dozen witnesses who can confirm we were nowhere near here when the poor dear had her accident. I activated the satellite phone and dialed 911 as their car began pulling away. The signal was crystal clear despite the storm. 911, what's your emergency? This is Amelia Richardson at 4847 Mountain View Road. I need to report an attempted murder and theft conspiracy. 2 individuals just tried to strand me in a blizzard to steal my inheritance. They're driving a blue BMW sedan, license plate. I rattled off the number I had memorised months ago. Ma'am, are you in immediate danger? Not anymore, I said, watching their taillights disappear into the storm. But they will be. What David and Victoria didn't know was that the mountain road had only one exit, and that exit was currently blocked by a massive tree that had fallen across the highway 3 hours ago. The storm had brought it down, just as the weather service had predicted. In my first life, they had discovered this obstacle on their way back to town, but by then it was too late to return. They had already committed to their alibi. This time, they would find themselves trapped on a mountain road with no cell service, no way forward, and nowhere to go but back to the cabin they thought they had sealed shut. I used my spare key to let myself back inside, then settled by the window with a cup of hot coffee to wait. The recording device had captured everything. The satellite phone had connected me to emergency services, and the blizzard that was meant to be my executioner would instead become their prison. 27 minutes later, I saw headlights struggling through the storm, moving much slower than when they had left. David's car crept back up the driveway, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the heavy snow. I watched them sit in the car for several minutes, clearly arguing about their next move. Finally, David got out and approached the front door. His confident stride had been replaced by the careful steps of a man walking on very thin ice. He knocked. Amelia? Amelia, are you there? I took my time answering, letting him knock several more times before opening the door. His face was pale with cold and something that might have been fear. David, what are you doing back? I thought you left for town. The road is blocked, he said, stepping inside without invitation. A tree fell across the highway. We're trapped here until morning. Oh my, I said, allowing appropriate concern to colour my voice. How terrible. It's a good thing I had spare keys, or I would have been locked out in the storm. The colour drained completely from his face. Spare keys? My grandmother always kept extras hidden around the property. Didn't I mention that? Victoria appeared in the doorway behind him, snow coating her expensive coat like accusations. Her eyes were wild with the beginning of true panic. We need to call for help, she said, pulling out her phone. The cell towers must be down. I'm getting no signal. The landline is out too, I lied smoothly. The storm must have knocked down the phone lines. We're completely cut off until the roads are cleared. I watched them exchange glances. The first honest communication they had shared all evening. They were beginning to understand that they were trapped here with the woman they had just tried to murder. With the woman who now knew exactly what they were. Well, I said, settling into my grandmother's favourite armchair, I suppose we should make the best of it. After all, we have all night to talk. David's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket where he kept the cabin keys. The keys that would no longer help him because I had others. Victoria's breathing had become shallow and rapid, the sound of someone realising their perfect plan had developed fatal flaws. Outside, the storm raged with the fury of nature unleashed. Inside, a different kind of storm was about to begin. I had been the victim once, dying alone in the cold while they escaped to luxury and lies. Now they would experience the terror of being trapped with someone who knew their secrets, someone who had already died once and had nothing left to fear, someone who had spent months planning a very different kind of justice. So, I said pleasantly, shall we discuss those legal documents you had me sign, the ones that transfer my inheritance to my husband upon my death? I have some questions about the authenticity of your notary stamp, Victoria. The silence that followed was broken only by the howling wind and the sound of their world collapsing around them, one truth at a time. This time, I would be the one walking away from the wreckage,